It was a heady tale of adventure, swashbuckling on the seven seas, a crazy captain and his band of merry musketeers. And then one day, the adventure almost came to an end. Welcome back to Sailing El Jaleo. Now this week's episode is going to be a little different. I'm going to be talking, this is going to be out of sequence, and I'm going to be talking about something that has happened to El Jaleo twice. And it was kind of scary, and I thought it might have been the end of our travels, at least for this season. So I inadvertently, I guess you would never do it on purpose, but I hydrolocked the engine twice. And I thought I had it figured out. And the first time it happened was in Delaware City, and I am not, so this YouTube stuff, this filming doesn't come to me naturally. It's not my first inclination. As a matter of fact, you've seen my videos, you know how shite they are, so you know this just is not something I focus on. And when I discovered that my engine was full of water in Delaware City, I actually didn't film any of it, and that's just because when something major happens, my first inclination is not to film it, it's to fix the problem. So I fixed it in Delaware City, and I thought I had the problem solved, but then it happened again in Deltaville, Virginia. And I was able to go back and figure everything out, why exactly it was happening, how to stop it from happening. And so I'm going to talk about that this time. Now this is going to be boring for most people, but it might save someone's ass someday. So if you ever have a hydrolocked engine, it's not the end of the world. You can fix it, and you can fix it yourself. You don't have to hire someone to do it, and they might charge you thousands of dollars. It's not that complicating. So I'm going to go through what happened and how to fix it if it happens to you. And you might hear some noise. Right now we're in Hampton, Virginia. It's very windy outside. I've got the diesel heater going, the wind generator's pumping, so apologies if you hear any noise. The first thing I had to do was to discover that the engine was hydrolocked, and I first knew something was very seriously wrong when I went to check the oil. So every morning before I start the engine, I do my checks, and one of those checks is to check the oil. And when I checked the dipstick, it had 3 times the amount of oil that there was supposed to be. So I knew something was catastrophically wrong right off the bat. And, I checked it a few times, and the water, and it was 3 times the level it should have been. And, you could tell there was water in the oil. So I knew I had a problem. I didn't know the scope of the problem. So I did try and turn over the engine. And of course it wouldn't turn because it was hydrolocked. So the cylinders were full of water. So I knew I had to get the water out, and to do that I needed to gain access to the cylinders. There were a couple of different ways to do it. I had no idea about any of this, so I talked to the marina, and they're very helpful. They said remove the fuel injectors and then turn the engine by hand to remove the water. And I called Frank because, this is Frank's baby, and she's now my baby, and I trust Frank in all things El Jaleo. And he recommended removing the glow plugs instead. And that makes a lot of sense because the fuel injectors, it's a lot more complicating to remove them. You need to remove fuel lines, and there are little fitting rings that go into the bottom. I think they're bronze. They may be a different metal, but there's a little piece of metal at the end of the injector, and when the injectors get seated into that fitting, they can only be used once. And this engine is no longer manufactured, so getting those replacement parts would be difficult at best, and why do it if it's easier just to remove the glow plugs? And it was much easier. So here I am removing the glow plugs, and it was as easy as removing the electrical wires and then screwing out the glow plugs, and then I had access to the cylinder so I could get the water out. Once the glow plugs are removed comes probably the most tense part of the entire thing. If the water has only been in the engine for a little while and you haven't severely damaged it, you should be able to manually turn the crankshaft. And that is the largest central pulley on the engine. I was able to turn it by hand, so I could just grab it. Now, you know, if you have a huge engine, you might not be able to turn it by hand, but I was able to. This is just a 42 horse. So I was able to turn the crankshaft by hand, just turn that pulley. I turned it clockwise, and that actuated the pistons, and then it allowed the water to be expelled through the glow plug holes. If you're not able to turn the crankshaft by hand, you can put a socket wrench on there and try and turn it. If you get a long-handled wrench, you might be able to break it free if some rust has started to form. Now, I'm not a diesel mechanic, so that is above my pay grade. I got really lucky. I discovered that I had a hydrolocked engine within 24 hours of when it happened, so there does not seem to be any damage that was caused. The engine was free turning. I've run it since. I've made trips since both occasions, and yeah, so I think I got really lucky. After I got the majority of the water out by hand, I did use the starter motor to force the remainder of the water out, and that was pretty exciting. After removing all of the water from the cylinders, I did have to do an oil change prior to trying to start the engine. Since I had water in the oil, I knew it was going to be a long process to try and get all of the water out of the oil channels in the engine. So I did my initial oil change, and then I started the engine. I ran it for a couple of minutes, and then I shut it down and I checked the oil again. It was milky, so I knew there was still water in there. So I did a whole nother oil change, and El Jaleo uses 5 quarts for an oil change and an oil filter, and you know, it's not hard, but it's just a time-consuming process. I have got a little pump on a drill, you know, a drill pump that I pump all the oil out and then refill it, and it's just a pain in the butt. So I did the initial oil change, and you know, oil is lighter than water, so I could see I pumped about 1.5 gallons of water out of the oil pan before the oil started coming out. And then, you know, I ran the engine. I did my second oil change. It was milky, so I pumped that out. I did a third oil change. It was still milky. There was, you know, you could tell the oil was off color, so I did another oil change. That was my third one. And then finally, by the fourth oil change, there was no water left in the oil. So then I knew I was good. So in between these, you know, the oil changes, I did run the engine for a couple of minutes each time to allow the oil to circulate in the engine to get any water that was trapped in there out. So, you know, all in all, it was the first time, like I said, I didn't film anything. All of this film is from the second occasion when it happened in Deltaville, and yeah, it's a stressful process. It's not something you want to go through, especially, you know, when it happened in Delaware City. I'm like, okay, if the worst thing happens, I can always get hauled back out and, you know, deal with it then. But, you know, when you're away from home and it happens again, thank gosh, the first time it happened somewhere where I was safe and I could get help. If this had happened in Alligator River when I didn't have communication, I don't know what I would have done, quite honestly. So now I know how to handle this situation if it ever happens again. I certainly don't want it ever to happen again. You can do serious damage to your engine, obviously. Salt water and steel do not mix. So the problem here was trying to figure out why exactly this was happening and just to put an end to it. So the final piece of this puzzle was figuring out exactly what happened. Now, what happened in Delaware City is a distinctively different event than what happened in Deltaville. So it's a little bit confusing. We don't know exactly what happened the first time, and there was a part of this that I didn't include just because it doesn't seem relevant to the hydrolocking of the engine, although it may have contributed to the first event. So it's a little confusing, but so this was raw water that was getting into the engine. So the engine has a coolant in it, like your antifreeze, and that circulates through a heat exchanger, and then it's got a raw water pump, which brings in raw water from outside, sends it through that heat exchanger, and that is that water is then sent through the exhaust, and that helps cool the exhaust so you don't burn a hole in the side of your boat, from your exhaust. So the first time when El Jaleo was put back in the water in Delaware City, I fired up the engine and there was no water coming out of the exhaust. So that's a problem. And I shut everything down and I took the raw water pump apart. That's a pain in the butt. It's on the back side of the engine. You have to remove the alternator and some other stuff to get to it. And there's Neptune. It's not an easy fix. But I changed out the impeller. Now what was puzzling about this was the impeller it's got 6 arms on it, like 6 paddles, and that's what pulls the water through the engine. And only one of them was broken off, which is confusing because it still should have been pumping water, so why was there no water coming out of the exhaust? So the theory there was that when it was on the hard, mud wasps or something got up inside the exhaust and physically blocked the exhaust. And the impeller wasn't able to push through that initially, and that caused water to flow back through the exhaust into the engine. So that's what we think happened the first time. Now the second time, there is an anti-siphon or a vacuum breaker on the exhaust line. So you don't want water, once you shut off the engine, you don't want water flowing backwards from the exhaust into the engine. And the vacuum breaker or the siphon breaker was 40 years old, and there was a fitting that Frank had put on it. He had soldered a brass fitting on there with a line, so if any water ever came out of that anti-siphon, which it should not have, water should never come out of the anti-siphon, air should only go into it. So that fitting broke, that little extra part that he put on there. Now that shouldn't have affected the way it functions, but it should have been a red flag because brass does not handle or does not stand up to contact with salt water for very long. So I should have realized when that piece broke, I should have recognized that water was coming out of the anti-siphon valve, which means that it wasn't working the way that it was designed to. Now I tried to fix it. So I drilled out that fitting and I put the tube back in because I didn't fully understand how this anti-siphon valve worked. And so when there's water flowing through the exhaust, it's supposed to push a diaphragm up, which will prevent water from coming out of the anti-siphon device. And then when the water flow is stopped, when you shut off the engine, that diaphragm falls back down because the falling water column sucks the diaphragm down, and then air can enter through that. So if water's ever coming out of there, that's a sign that your diaphragm is bad. I didn't recognize that. I tried to fix it by putting the hose back on because I didn't understand exactly how it worked. So then when I shut down the engine, when I got to Deltaville, that drain line was full of water, so there was no way that air could get back inside of the anti-siphon valve to break the suction or to break the siphon. So then it filled up the engine with water. Now I did get lucky. I was planning on staying in Deltaville for like 3 or 4 days because we had some high winds coming in, but I did some routine maintenance. I adjusted the stuffing box, changed the zinc in the heat exchanger, these kinds of things. And when you do that, it's good to run the engine forward and reverse, make sure your drip rate on the stuffing box doesn't change. That's a whole nother thing. But so luckily I caught that I caught that the engine was hydrolocked again, and that allowed me to fix it, within 24 hours. Now, if I had sat there in Deltaville for 4 or 5 days with an engine full of water and I hadn't realized it, I feel like I wouldn't have been able to fix it in this method. So now, as a precaution, at least for this entire season, I'm going to be checking the oil every night after I stop, running the engine, because that'll alert me if there's a problem. And so the problem with the anti-siphon valve, now this was a 40-year-old anti-siphon device, and it's more expensive to try and get a new diaphragm than just to replace the entire thing. So in Deltaville, I did buy a replacement. I just ordered it to the local marina, and then I went in and picked it up, and I swapped it out. The new one is almost identical to the old one from 40 years ago, so it's kind of funny, and it ran perfectly. So then I did the run yesterday from Deltaville down to Hampton, where I am now, and everything worked fine. So on that anti-siphon valve, when you shut off the engine, if you listen, you can actually hear it sucking air. So I know it's working correctly. I checked the oil last night. Everything's fine. I hope this issue is completely put to bed, because this is, not only does it cost a lot in oil and oil filters and time and frustration, you know, it could ruin your engine. So I feel like I dodged 2 bullets. I got extremely lucky. I don't want this ever to happen again. I don't, you know, if it happens to you, it sucks. I know what you're going through. I've been through it a few times. So, you know, this is how you can fix it if it does happen to you. And, you know, if it does, I hope you catch it early enough, and good luck. And that's all we have time for this week. I would like to give a massive shout out to my Patreon crew. Without your guys' support, I wouldn't make these videos. And my Patreon crew is Joan and Juddy Judnick, Val and Chris Alcorn, Denise and Eli Sackett, Sherry Erickson, Deb Shaw, Matthew Spotton, Peter Allen, and Natalie Linehan. Thank you guys so very much. Your support really means the world to me. I do have one legacy patron member, and her name is Joan Linbo. Unfortunately, she has passed on, but she lives on in our hearts forever. We really miss you, Joan. If you are interested in joining our Patreon crew, there is a link in the description down below, and that'll take you to our Patreon page where you can sign up. And there are hundreds, literally hundreds of extra videos and photos of our travels, and I try and keep everything there up to date and post at least once or twice a week, so it gives you a little peek behind the curtain. If you do like our videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. That'll help us out more than you'll ever know, and that actually doesn't cost you anything, so hit that like button. Alrighty, I hope you all are well, and we'll see you next week.